might never die, but as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, heeds thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies, thyself by foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and tender churl makes waste in negarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by their grave and thee.
Sonnet 1 matters because it functions like a manifesto for the entire sequence of all the 50-plus sonnets by Shakespeare. It's not merely first by numbering, it introduces the sonnet's central fixation, which is beauty and time, increase and loss, nature and debt, self-love and self-harm, legacy and oblivion. It also declares the sequence's audacity. Instead of worshipping an unattainable beloved in the usual Renaissance manner, the speaker begins by scolding the person that he's sending the poems to. The poem is persuasion masquerading as a sort of song, as a lyric. It moves with the neatness of a syllogism. First comes the general principle, like something out of philosophy. From fairest creatures we desire increase. Increase is not more attention or more time spent admiring. It is literal propagation. Beautiful things should reproduce. That claim is softened and made elegant through emblem and horticulture. Beauty's rose. A rose in beauty is in bloom, but it is beauty with an expiry date. And that expiry arrives immediately. But as the riper, that's the rose, should by time decease or die, his tender air, the bud, might bear his memory. Beauty fades. The older flower dies, but the seed preserves the line carrying beauty forward in a form that time cannot immediately erase. Air is doing double work here. It is biological and financial at the same time. Beauty is treated like an estate, like a household. It ought not to be hoarded, but transmitted to the next generation. Before the youth is even addressed, the poem has framed reproduction as a duty to time and to posterity to pass on the gift, whether literally with children or metaphorically to pass it on. Then the turn comes, sharp and prosecutional. But thou, the youth, is the exception to that principle. The phrase, contracted to thine own bright lies, is pivotal. Contracted can mean pledged or betrothed, as in a contract of marriage. But here it suggests also perverse self-marriage, a manustupacious closed circuit of self-obsession. It also implies narrowing, shrinking, reducing the scope of one's life to a private theatre of self-regard. The youth is not merely pleased with himself, he is bound to himself. And the next image intensifies the charge. He feeds thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel. The metaphor is of a flame that consumes its own existence, its own substance, like a candle eating through its own wax. The youth's beauty becomes an engine of self-consumption. That is why the poem's paradox lands so hard, making a famine where abundance lies. Beauty is abundance, but hoarded beauty produces starvation, not because beauty is scarce, but because it is withheld from circulation. The ethical climax follows. Thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. Vanity is not presented as harmless, it is framed as self-violence, a slow suicide carried out through narcissistic enclosure. At this point, Shakespeare widens the frame from private psychology to public value. The youth is the world's fresh ornament, a decorative asset to society, and only herald to the gaudy spring. Herald makes him an announcement, the sign that spring has arrived. You can imagine him standing there in a tabard with a little trumpet. Spring is the season of fertility. To be spring's herald while refusing increase is the poem's central contradiction. He embodies the world's generative moment, yet he refuses generation. Now comes a line that looks simple but is densely suggestive. Within thine own bud buryest thy content. The youth is not in flower but in bud, closed, withheld, not opening outward, like a pine cone, like the pineal gland, encased in the brain, buryest. Oh, that's a chilling word. It anticipates the grave and implies a living burial, as though youth is entombing what should unfold into bloom and fruit. Content can mean what is contained, the inner substance, but it also brushes against contentment and satisfaction. The line is doing what Shakespeare often does in the sonnets. It holds a respectable public meaning in plain sight, while allowing a more intimate meaning to shimmer underneath. That shimmer matters when you press the poem's repeated language of feeding, waste, and hoarding. The youth feeds his flame with self-substantial fuel. He makes waste while niggarding, wasting by hoarding, throwing stuff away by hoarding it. An oxymoron. He will save himself by giving himself more freely. But instead, he feeds himself. He is a glutton in the couplet. Taken at the surface level, these are moral economic metaphors. Miserliness, selfishness, refusal of social duty. But the sonnet is also, remember, a procreation poem obsessed from its first line with increase, air, and the continuation of beauty through generation. In that context, self-feeding and waste is exactly what you think it is. It can plausibly carry sexual undertones without ever becoming explicit. The poem's accusation is that the youth prefers a sterile, closed loop of self-regard to the risky outwardness of a generative relationship. If one chooses the imaginary permits, if one chooses the imagery, permits the insinuation that he is more devoted to private self-satisfaction, even an autoerotic habit, than to marriage and procreation. Shakespeare does not prove that. He doesn't need to. Rhetorically, the insinuation is effective precisely because it remains deniable, half hidden inside the botanical and economic language. The speaker can shame the youth for sterile self-consumption while maintaining decorum. This is reinforced by the sonnet's vocabulary of stinginess. Niggarding is an old word meaning miserly hoarding. The insult is that a youth so tender, so fresh, behaves like Scrooge, like a petty miser burying his wealth rather than investing it. And that leads directly to the ultimatum of the couplet: pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by the grave and thee. The couplet's cruelty lies in its double devouring. The grave will consume everyone. The grave devours. That is the universal tax on life. But the youth is also consuming what is owed to the world, the due of his beauty, his increase, his heir. If he refuses, the only sharers in his beauty will be himself and the grave. One devourer is inevitable, the other is chosen. And it's his choice. The deeper scandal of Sonnet 1 is therefore not merely have children, and that is the message. It is the claim that beauty is not private property. It is a loan from nature, and nature expects interest. And that is a scandal and a duty. That is why the poem feels at once intimate and political. A young man's private pleasure is turned into a public offence, and it establishes the governing tension of the sequence of poems. Shakespeare will repeatedly insist that the self is never only the self. That desire which circles back on itself becomes sterile, and time punishes closed circuits. So this is Tim, and please come back for Sonnet 2. I will eventually get through all of them.